Welcome back to my YouTube channel, guys. My name is Cheri Anderson. I am a multi-million-dollar producing agent here in Michigan, and I'm sitting with the Honorable rlinnell, and he's a real estate attorney here in Michigan, one of the best, if not the best. I'll brag for you. I looked you up. Your reviews are spectacular. So congratulations to that. It's over like 400, right?
Yes, I'm fortunate. I'm lucky.
Yeah, you are lucky, and really you have a really great establishment. So I'm excited to share some topics that the audience don't really know about when it comes to buying and selling, and how you play a major role in a lot of buyers and sellers, and how even things like far as when you go into foreclosure, how you can potentially get your equity back, and why it's important investors may need an attorney and things like that. So just a few topics. So you definitely want to stay to the end of this video so you can get as much value as possible. So let's get into it. So Rick, say hi to the audience one more time.
Hi, audience. It's great to be here, Cheri. I don't get that many opportunities to do this kind of stuff, so I appreciate it. And you said I had a lot of views, and it's true. It did take a long time, but when you're as old as me, you have a lot of time on your side. But it's given me a chance to see all kinds of things in real estate, all different scenarios. And I wouldn't say that I've seen everything, but between myself and the 7 other attorneys that work for me, because of our focus on real estate, we've seen a lot.
A lot, yes. Okay, so let's get right into the meat, right? So can you tell us a little bit more about yourself? What inspired you to become a real estate attorney, and then like some of the accomplishments or achievements that you are proud of in this industry?
Sure. So I have been an attorney since 1998. I'm bred locally, raised locally, went to school locally. I went to Michigan undergrad, and I went to Wayne State for law school.
Nice.
When I was in law school, I had a job at one of the big firms downtown after my first summer, and it wasn't bad, but it wasn't that stimulating. And I was fortunate enough in my second year, summer, to get a job with a small real estate development firm located in Bloomfield Hills.
Okay.
And I said, all right, I'm going to give this a try. And I got there and I started learning about real estate. And I said, this is for me. I love this. And the gentlemen that I worked for were real estate developers for the most part. They were developing all kinds of property types, gas stations, childcare, assisted living, light industrial, retail, mid-rises. They were doing it mostly in Michigan, but also in Ohio, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. And as I said, I loved it. I loved everything about it. I was fortunate enough that they hired me after I passed the bar exam to become a full-time employee. And I said, this is what I'm going to do.
That's amazing.
When I worked for them, they were a small company. They were very well off, but they were small. And because they're small, they would allow me to do things that I quite honestly, I would tell them, I'm like, are you sure you want me to do this? I said, I have a degree in economics, not a degree in construction, not a degree in finance, and they said, we're watching, Rick. We want you to do this. So they would allow me to go out and seek properties. So I would knock on the farmer's door. I would call the building owner's door. I would write letters of intent, purchase agreements. I would do all the work before municipalities. So getting approvals for rezoning or zoning board of appeals, variances, PUD, PRD, all these things that were so interesting to me, and would watch these developments go up, and sometimes I would actually be responsible for developments. For the gentleman I worked for, I developed over 500 single-family lots.
Wow.
And it really not only did it teach me a lot, but it just, my love grew. And the way they did things was that I would bring deals in, and I didn't have the money they had, but if you brought the deal in, you would get a small percentage. That was great. But there are certain deals that they would say are too small, and I'd say, small? This is still a big deal, and I would love to do this. And so we made an arrangement that they allowed me to develop on my own, so I could build subdivisions on my own. And I started doing that, and it was almost as easy as what I saw for them. And I had to give away most of my deals because I didn't have the money, but I started doing my own deals. And unfortunately, when things got rough in about 2007, the gentleman I worked for, it started to go bad for them. They eventually filed bankruptcy. I said, oh, this is terrible. These guys are almost like family, almost like a second dad. The owner was like a mentor to me. And of course, what I didn't realize was I had my own large developments. And they went first, and then I went second. Now, I didn't have to go bankrupt, but it was unpleasant. Oh, yeah, bad times. And I tell that story because even though that happened, and you'd think it might test my love of real estate,
right,
it didn't. In fact, it was the real estate industry, specifically residential brokers, that brought me back. I'd been doing workouts, commercial workouts, which is really like a giant short sale for commercial properties for the gentleman that I worked for myself. And some of the residential brokers I knew said, well, can you come in and do a short sale? And I said, well, I've never done a short sale. I said, Rick, if you've done commercial workouts, which I had done workouts for...
Wait, what's a short sale? Tell, because this is important, right?
Sure.
We don't see that as much as now, since, I feel like personally, as I continue to do real estate, I know there's still a lack of inventory, so we don't see as many short sales. But can you just explain to the audience?
Yeah, happy to do it. So a short sale is selling a property for less than what's owed to the bank. It's selling it short of what's owed. And the bank, when it works properly, and the bank says yes, the bank agrees to accept that lesser amount as payment in full. So as the debtor, you get to walk away, you don't owe anything, even though your house was worth less than what you owed. So there's advantages for the borrower, or debtor I call them.
Right.
It doesn't impact your credit as much. It allows you to get back into the real estate market. There probably is going to be a short period of time, depending on the lender, maybe a year, maybe as much as 2 years, where you can't buy, but versus going bankrupt,
right, in that
or a foreclosure, where it's much more detrimental to your credit, and takes a much longer time to get back in the marketplace. So I started doing short sales, and at this point we have done more than 4,000 short sales, which that's one of the things I'm proud of, because these are people that were in distress, that were experiencing the worst times of their life, financially, sometimes health-wise. And so we were able to help them. And I could empathize with it because I had just gone through similar things with my own real estate investment. But I want to be clear. We still do short sales, but we might get one a month.
Right?
We were getting like 50 a month.
And that's a huge difference, because the market is way better.
I want to be clear. The market is as strong as can be. Short sales happen really for unique situations.
Right.
God forbid somebody becomes ill and they can't work anymore, or someone, the main breadwinner passes away, sometimes a divorce shortly after buying a property. But these are very unique situations. Our market is very strong, and so
even with the short sales of properties, even those prices of the houses are kind of going over what the bank or the investor at the time was asking for, right? Yeah,
so we would see short sales where properties were selling for anywhere from $50,000 to $500,000 less than what was owed. Now, if we see a short sale, it's like $5,000 to $25,000. So, and that's only because somebody got a high leverage loan, and maybe they overpaid a little bit, but it's a rare situation. So just to finish, the short sales really is what kept my family going. I have 5 children, and without the short sales and that income, we would have been in big trouble. So thank you to the real estate industry.
So you took advantage of that time instead of, it didn't decimate your company or things that it kind of accelerates your business, right?
It hurt. Don't get me wrong. It hurt. It hurt. But it, I was at a low point, and it allowed me to come out of the low point. And then as the market got better, we started doing the things that I'd always known how to do. Representing people, buyers and sellers, representing borrowers in land contracts, borrowers in mortgages, boundary disputes, seller disclosure issues, contract enforcement, land use, everything that I knew how to do, which quite honestly, for several years, people said, you may not do that, Rick, but I am not interested in that because real estate sounds like a bad idea. So now granted, that's all many years ago. And so it's sort of those short sales that really kept me going, and that really got my foothold in the residential industry. Before that, I was all commercial. Oh, wow. Now we do commercial and residential, but the residential market is really what propped me up. So I remember that's really what kept my family going.
And you were introduced into that, right? That wasn't
I was not looking for that. I was looking for anything, quite honestly. Exactly. I remember my wife said to me, she's like, well, you got to go get a job. And I said, I don't think you understand. She's like, what do you mean I don't understand? I said, the skill set I have, nobody wants to talk about. Nobody. Yeah. Because nobody was building land. Nobody was developing land at that point. Everyone tried to get rid of their land. So
that's true.
But I feel thankful that real estate has not been perfect, but it's been pretty good, and I still love it today.
That is great to hear. So it sounds, look, this is why you were on this show, and I'm introducing you. You're one of the best here in Michigan. So that's why I'm so grateful to have this opportunity. So I know you spoke of land contracts. And typically a land contract is beneficial to someone that can't really obtain like traditional like financing for a property. So can you kind of explain what like a land contract is, and then how you can essentially help buyers and sellers when it comes to finalizing a contract of that sort?
Sure. So a land contract is a form of seller financing where the seller acts as a bank instead of going to, your neighborhood bank and getting a loan. Instead, the seller actually provides that financing. And in return, the seller gets paid interest just like the bank would. Mm-hmm. That's really what it is at its core. Most land contracts are governed by federal law. Mm-hmm. So there are requirements that the interest rate can only be so high. There are some requirements if you're not selling your own home for a seller. But basically, you're acting as a lender. Right. And from you mentioned that, from a buyer's perspective, it can be beneficial because sometimes they don't have strong enough credit, so they can't get a bank loan. Right. They'll get a land contract, and so that's beneficial for them. And then oftentimes they'll refinance the land contract maybe into even more competitive bank rates, a lower interest rate. Right. But that's not a requirement. Mm-hmm. So it's a nice way for buyers to get in the marketplace, maybe who've had some credit in the past, like a short sale. Mm-hmm. Granted, we don't see those, but that would be an example of how it might benefit. And so a seller might say, well, that's great for a buyer, Rick, but how is that good for me? Well, oftentimes it can be beneficial for a seller. And the reason it can be beneficial is that, as I said, the seller gets an interest rate, just like the bank does. What you traditionally see is that the interest rate that a seller gets is oftentimes maybe 1%, maybe even 2% higher than what would be traditionally offered by a bank. And most sellers, they say, this is great, I'm going to sell my property and I'm going to get, $100,000. And they say, well, what am I going to do with the $100,000? I'm going to put it in my savings account and I'm going to get, a 0.5% a year. So this is a way, unless you have something you need to do with your money, which we see a lot of sellers who have enough equity that they don't know what they're going to do with their money. Mm-hmm. Here's a way to actually make an interest rate on your money. Yeah. And so it can be quite a good investment for a seller. Mm-hmm. You receive the money over time, so you pay taxes when you actually achieve the gain, which is over several years. So it can be very beneficial for a seller as well as a purchaser. The other thing is you will traditionally see a relatively strong down payment. With FHA financing, some other financing.
So you need capital. Let's just say you need capital.
I traditionally see purchasers in a land contract putting as much as, or as little as 10% down. Right. I can't say I've never seen below that, but 10% down. And I've seen as much as maybe 25%. Mm-hmm. And so again, if you're the owner of the home, you sell it, you get 10%. If the person fails, they can't make good on their payments, you take the home back, but you keep the 10%.
Exactly.
So not that that's what anyone wants to happen, and that not that happens all the time, but if you're a seller, that's how you protect yourself. That's your hedge against risk, is you've already gotten a portion of that down payment, or a portion of that purchase price, I should say. Mm-hmm. And now if the buyer doesn't perform, you take the home back.
So it reverts back to the seller.
Correct. Well, there's a legal step, but effectively it's what you said. It does revert back to the seller. So it can be really a beneficial way to do it. The other thing that you sometimes see, and not always, is that if you're the seller, you sometimes can achieve a little bit better purchase price because the buyer who's not about distressed, but has a little bit of a credit issue, right? They don't have as many choices. Now, I'm not suggesting that a buyer, that a seller should take advantage of a buyer, but the reality is if the home is listed for $200,000, well, in this market, you might not get $200,000. You might get $190,000, $195,000. Right. But in a land contract, if you're offering those terms, well, the buyer doesn't have quite as many options. And so as a seller, you might say, no, it's $200,000 or nothing. And as long as it's priced reasonably fair, seller's likely to get that with land contract terms.
Because you don't have to do an appraisal or anything like that. You can just go right into the contract.
Yep.
And it's between you and the person.
Yeah. And the buyer, they don't have as many choices. I think, part of the reason why you don't see as many land contracts, although we do see them, is because people want their money. But I think there's a portion of people that just don't understand what they are, because I think a lot of sellers would say, yeah, I'd actually like to do that.
Do you think it would be useful, especially in this market where there's a lot of uncertainty? Like one of the biggest banks, like Silicon Valley, they just went and sovereign, right? So do you think like now, because I was prospecting and I had a gentleman tell me like he wanted to sell his house, the market is up, right? But now he's like, no, I think I'm gonna just keep the real estate because it's safe.
Well, so I think the land contract, again, if you don't have somewhere to put your money, and you bring up a story of a bank failing, which is unfortunate, but it shakes everyone's confidence.
Right.
When you do a land contract, you're still, I don't know, I'm not trying to think of the words I would use, but you're still sort of betting on or relying upon the value in the home. Because if that buyer fails, you get the home back. If the buyer pays, then let's say you're getting 7% in your money or 8% in your money. Much better than you're going to get in the bank. And if people are worried about the stock market and worried about these things, that most people feel pretty darn confident about that because they know their home.
Right.
The worst thing that happens is you get your home back and you get to keep the down payment. So most people are like, yeah, that's a pretty good investment. Unless I've got some great investment out there, that actually sounds like a good idea. So I do think that for people that are concerned about selling real estate and what they'll do with the money, a land contract can make a lot of sense.
Yeah, that's a great point. Okay, so let's talk about some of the more common obstacles you may see in different cases. And can you give us an example of like some of the common obstacles that you see that buyers or sellers may come to you with?
Well, we get a lot of seller disclosure cases. So there's something called the Seller Disclosure Act. And what it effectively says is that a seller must tell a buyer about the condition of the home. There is no duty of the seller to inspect the home. So you don't have to inspect your own home. You don't have to hire a professional inspector. But you do have to disclose what you know. And you have to disclose within reference to the form itself. In other words, you only have to disclose what questions are asked on the form. Right. And they're important things like, are you aware of work being done without a permit? Are you aware of water infiltrating the foundation or basement? Is there a structural issue? So significant things that you would care about. And it's interesting to me, especially in our market now. The market is very difficult. It's a very strong seller's market, which everyone thought, including me, well, the bank rates are going up. Okay, the market's going to soften.
Anything.
In fact, I'd be curious what you have to say, but I'm hearing stories that the market, if anything, has gotten more competitive.
It has, especially in certain areas. So the more desirable the area is, it's like people are still bidding way over asking price. When I say like I have a client that's looking at like Dearborn, Allen Park, like those houses are easily selling over. If it's updated, of course, they're easily selling over like $20,000. Up to the highest one I've seen so far in this current market is $40,000 over asking price. So it's insane. I can only imagine like in Oakland County and Macomb County how people have money, feasible money, where they can just go over asking price and they can waive like the inspections, appraisal, and things like that because they have the excess capital. So it's like, yeah, it's crazy.
I spoke to a woman this morning and she has looked at 40 homes. She'd made 6 offers that were either at asking or she said as much as $5,000 over asking. She has not even gotten a call back.
Oh, that's because you need an agent like me. Because there are strategies you can set in place. Like sometimes what you can do is instead of looking for properties that are just going live on the market or coming soon, maybe take a look at properties that have been on the market for days, right? So days on the market is really important, right? Because the newer houses, they tend to have more buyers, so more competition. So if it's a house that's been sitting on the market for like 7 days, take a look at it and just be open-minded to like the cosmetic things, as long as you don't have any structural issues or the roof isn't bad. And if you just have to do like a updated kitchen, a bathroom, see those options because honestly, it'll save you a lot of time and money.
So that's what's going to be my point is what I'm seeing is because people are so, I guess, desperate, maybe is the right word, to get into the marketplace or to get to a bigger home or to downsize or wherever they're trying to get in the real estate market, people are waiving inspections, which is very dangerous. I'm not saying it. I'm not going to say you shouldn't do it, but it's very dangerous. But they're also, to me, looking past other issues. Right. And, to me, a buyer needs to sort of temper, I want to be in a home with, I don't want to be in a home that's not going to be what I thought I was buying. That I'm going to be buying, a property that needs $25,000, $50,000, $75,000 worth of work that I didn't plan on. If you plan on it, that's one thing.
Right.
Say, well, hey, I'm going to put this much money in. The price is right. The total I'll have into it makes sense.
But you don't buy at the top of the market and still have to put that much money into it.
And we see many situations where I'll give a recent example.
Okay.
Person bought a home. And they called me up and they said, Rick, I bought the home. I moved in. Within 2 weeks, I found water in the basement. And the seller never told me about water in the basement.
Was it on the seller disclosures?
Well, I'm going to get to that. That's the exact question you had. So I said, so they never disclosed it. No, Rick, they never disclosed it. And I said, okay, well, if they've never disclosed it, that puts you in a pretty strong position to file a lawsuit for a claim of fraud. And they said, send me over the seller disclosure, send me over the purchase agreement. So they sent it over, and I look at the seller disclosure, and I said, well, it says, has there ever been evidence of water in the basement?
And
they wrote the word some. And I said, I'll just use Mrs. Jones. Mrs. Jones, when we talked, I asked if there had been water in the basement, and you said they no disclosure, but it says the word some.
Right.
Well, Rick, that's true. It does say the word some, but let me tell you what happened. I spoke to the seller. I went by the house and was showing someone in my family and saw the person there, and I said, hey, what does some mean? And they said, oh, well, some was just in the corner, the northwest corner of the basement, and I'd only seen it a couple times, and I don't really know why, but it was just some.
So.
And that was the end of what was said. They buy the house. And the problem is that, and I'm not saying this is what the seller did, but if some seller said, Rick, look, I'm going to commit fraud. I'm going to lie to my buyer. What's the best way to lie to my buyer?
But being as vague as possible.
Well, being vague and under-disclosing. In other words, don't say never been water.
Right.
Use the word like some, because some doesn't mean anything. It doesn't have a legal definition. It doesn't tell me if there's 3 inches across the whole basement, or it's like a damp spot that's as big as a basketball in the corner. It doesn't tell me anything. It just says some. And unfortunately, what I had to tell the client is, look, you can hire me, but you don't want to hire me because these cases are expensive. And to prove fraud, which is what you're asserting in these kind of cases, you have to prove that the seller lied to you. And in this case, they said some, and they said, yeah, but Rick, they explained to me. And I said, yeah, but none of that's in writing. All you can tell me is the words. And I'm going to guess somebody that committed fraud the first time is going to commit fraud the second time in court. And they're going to say, oh, I don't remember that conversation. No, I wrote some because there was some water there. And so this person didn't hire us, which I tell people, I'm like, I want to be hired, but I want to be hired because I think we can do something.
Right.
And the client is fully informed as to what we think can or can't happen. And so kind of going back to your question, some of the things that I think buyers do is they get either too eager or too trusting. And I'm not one of those people that thinks everybody's lying. I don't think that. I think most people tell the truth. But when you're going to spend the kind of money that you're talking about to buy a house, you want to be as certain as you can. Get the extra inspection. If someone says get a sewer inspection, get the sewer inspection. If someone says get a pest inspection, get the pest inspection. Make sure you've done everything reasonable to investigate the property before you spend whatever it is. It's going to be something significant.
So you can never be too safe.
Correct.
And
people say, yeah, but Rick, well, what if I find out something and I don't buy it? And I'd say, it was still worth it because you found out something that you avoided a problem. So if you spent $1,000 on inspections, I'd say money well spent. They say, but Rick, if they don't find anything, then I just wasted my money. I'd say, no, then you have the peace of mind of knowing that the house is in good condition. So
I would never tell my client to waive an inspection. If anything, if it's so competitive, but they really like the house, we have an hour or 45 minutes, an hour to tour the house. So you need to call your inspector and have them there as we tour the house. So at least they can take the time to look at the house to make sure you're buying a house that's going to give you your return on your investment. Because ultimately it's investment, right? It
is. And I agree with that. I understand their competitive markets. I've had clients that waived inspections. When I say clients, I don't list real estate. But as a lawyer, I've had clients say, Rick, I want the house. What should I do? And I say, well, I'm taking a big risk. I'm going to take the risk, Rick. So how do I minimize it? And your suggestion of bringing an inspector, going through and looking at the house, you want to make sure, in my opinion, you really want to make sure that you've investigated the house to the best of your abilities. Now, on the flip side, say, well, Rick, okay, you're talking to buyers, but what about sellers? Of course, as a seller, I don't want an inspection. I actually have a little bit different opinion. And the reason is because if I'm a seller and I sell the home and there's no inspection, I would be worried that if a buyer finds something, and that doesn't mean that the seller lied.
Mm-hmm.
The sellers don't always know. There is a first time that water goes in the basement. There's a first time that a roof leaks. They're always the first time, and it could be, during that transition. But what I'm worried about as a seller is the buyer says, I'll waive the inspection. Well, first of all, I'm worried that during that sort of due diligence period before the closing, that the buyer might get cold feet and say, wait a minute, I'm spending $300,000. I never even had it inspected. And what if and my dad said, be careful of this. And my brother said this, and my sister, and I don't want to do this anymore. And they walk from the transaction because they're scared. Mm-hmm. So that's one reason. But I think the bigger concern I have is that we were just talking about, well, if you're a buyer and there's some water in the basement, even though you might not know exactly how much water is, it makes a fraud case harder. You've got to do some investigation to really find out. And the court looks at you and says, well, you had a clue. It said some.
Right.
And so it makes it much harder to prevail in court. Well, now I'm the seller and my buyer didn't get inspection. They waived it. So the only thing they're relying on is what that seller disclosure says. And I would be worried that in court, a judge might say, well, wait a minute, seller, you knew every single word in here was going to be relied upon by the buyer because the buyer waived their inspection. So any words in there that were unclear, court might look at it more favorably for a buyer.
Wow.
Now, I'm not saying I've seen that happen, but it just makes me a little nervous that a court might say, no, seller, you knew exactly what was happening. Mm-hmm. You had a duty to make sure that you were clear and articulate in your words. Right. And if you didn't do a good job of explaining, where you answered yes, say to any question, it could possibly work against a seller in court.
So the inspection can protect the seller if they have that extra
So.
documentation.
Well, so here's an example. I can think of other cases where someone said, well, Rick, there was water infiltration and there was water damage on the wall and there was just some rot in the wood. Mm-hmm. And they never told me anything about that, Rick. And they sent her the seller disclosure. Doesn't say anything about that. Say, okay, so you had no idea. Nope, I never had a clue. I said, okay, now you get an inspection. I did. Send me over the inspection report. In the inspection report, the inspector writes, evidence of prior water infiltration, would have a contractor look at the cost of replacing the wood. And the buyer says, well, but Rick, the seller didn't tell me that, and they have a duty to tell me that. Mm-hmm. And I said, the standard is if you know, I don't care how you know, if you know as a buyer, then you cannot claim fraud. And so if there's an inspection from a seller standpoint, you had a second set of eyes, which either A, they may have found something and now the buyer knows, or B, they didn't find something, which I would say as a seller, that's right, I didn't know and they didn't know. Right. So if there was something, maybe it just happened or maybe nobody would have found out. Mm-hmm. And sort of on that same point, I can think of one in St. Clair Shores. Person goes to the house for the 48-hour walkthrough. So right before they're about to close, they want to just make sure the home's in the same condition.
It's the final walkthrough, so it's typically done 48 hours before closing.
Just to make sure the home is in the same condition it was when you signed the purchase agreement, did the original inspection, just like it was, but for a little wear and tear. And the person sees water in the garage. In fact, there's the owner is with two adult kids, and they're literally bucketing water out of the garage. It was a detached garage. Mm-hmm. But it was very close to the house, and they're bucketing water out. And the buyer says, but wait a minute, you never disclosed that. I mean, there's like 4 or 5 inches of water in there.
But at that point, they can walk away, right?
They could walk away. But instead, they purchased, and then they wanted to sue.
What?
It's not that unusual.
They knew of it, though.
I know.
Why would you proceed with the transaction?
So they pursued, they consummated the sale, and then they said, Rick, we've got to go after him. There's, the water in the garage. I mean, I never knew about it. And I said, yeah, but in your story, they told you before you bought. Mm-hmm. Well, what was I supposed to do, Rick? I didn't have anywhere to live. And I'm not making light of that. I understand. Right. And what the court would say is, if you buy, you've accepted it. If you don't buy, which you don't have to, maybe you have to get a hotel. Maybe you have to sleep on a friend's couch. Uncomfortable things, but
that leads into my next question.
Not as uncomfortable though as buying a house when you know there's damage.
Exactly. So what happens when someone? This is perfect. So what happens when someone have breached a contract? It could be a buyer or a seller. Can you give us some examples? Like how would that play out in court?
Sure. So the most common breach we see with a seller is they refuse to sell. they change their mind because maybe somebody offered them more money or whispered in their ear, hey, I'll pay you more, $5,000 more than Cheri will pay. And so they decide to be uncooperative with the buyer, or they just say, yeah, we changed our mind. And a buyer in that position it's a tough position because a buyer says, well, but I want the home. And okay, well, then I go to an attorney. And an attorney will tell them you can get what's called specific performance. Most of the time when there's a breach of a contract, the parties go to court and the party that says, hey, the other party breached, I was damaged. Damages usually equals money. So pay me a certain amount of money. But in real estate, specifically if you're the buyer, there isn't, let me take a step back. The courts look at every piece of property as unique and distinct. So even though we might have the same exact bungalow in Oak Park and it looks identical, it's the same floor plan, it's the same everything, courts view that as different. They're not the same. They're very close, but they're not the same. And because the courts view them as unique and distinct, the courts say, look, if you don't get to buy the bungalow at 123 Maple Street, there isn't an amount of money we can give you to make you whole. We don't know. I mean, you didn't pay for the house.
Can they like show that they missed out on other opportunities because of they're in contract with that house? Or
you could try to show that, but generally that's not going to succeed. But what the courts say is because it's unique and distinct, we couldn't say this many dollars would be fair to you, buyer, if the seller breached. What the courts do say is we will make the seller sell to you.
Oh, wow.
And we have done it many, many times.
So how long do you have to be within contract for the judge to give that ruling?
So if we sign a contract today and tomorrow the seller says, I'm not selling, you can go to court the next day. Now, realistically, it won't be quite that fast, but you could, by law, you could go to court the next day and sue and say the court force the sale. And courts will do it.
Wow.
They 100% will force the seller to sell. And I'll come back to specific performance in a second, but let's talk about from the sell side. So people often say, okay, Rick, so you tell me a court will make a seller sell. If the seller breaches, the court says, if you've breached seller, you have to sell to the buyer if the buyer wants it to happen. I say, yes. Okay, Rick, well then the same must be true. If the buyer breaches, the seller can make them buy. And the courts say, no. And here's the reason, which we kind of touched on earlier, and that is that if you're a seller, what do you expect from a transaction? You expect money.
Right.
And so the court says, we're not going to make that buyer buy. But buyer number one, they default. They say, I'm not buying. And they don't have an excuse. They don't have a finance contingency or an inspection or title, anything. They just say, I don't want to buy. The seller then finds, or their agent actually finds, buyer number two. And let's say buyer number two is paying $10,000 less than buyer number one. The seller sells to buyer number two. They get $10,000 less. They can now sue buyer number one for the $10,000.
The difference.
And generally speaking, they will win. And the idea is that the seller is made whole between the $10,000 from buyer number one and the rest of the price from buyer number two. They're whole. They got everything they were entitled to. And that's why the courts don't make buyers buy.
And they keep the earnest money deposits too, right?
They keep the earnest money deposit, yes. Now, as a practical matter, going back to the buyer and the seller who won't sell.
Okay.
If you're a buyer in that situation, you want an attorney to send a demand letter that says, look, you've breached the contract. I demand that in writing, seller, you acknowledge that the contract is valid, binding, and enforceable, that the buyer is not in breach of the contract, and that you will consummate the sale pursuant to the terms of the contract. In other words, just perform. In addition, you want to have the attorney file a claim of interest. And a claim of interest is a document that kind of acts like a lien. And what it does is it prevents the seller from selling to anyone else.
That's typically when the contract is sent through title, right? To title, that's when that interest is set in place?
Well, when the claim of interest is filed with the Register of Deeds, that once it's in place, the seller can no longer sell the property as a general rule. Because if that claim of interest exists, the new buyer can't use can't get a warranty deed, can't get title insurance, can't get a loan. So it effectively blocks all new buyers. And if a buyer said, I don't care about all those things, I'm a cash buyer and I'll take a quitclaim deed. When you take a quitclaim deed, you are effectively stepping into the shoes of the seller. So that claim of interest that says, hey, I'm buyer number one and I have this contract and seller refuses to sell to me. If the seller sold to some other seller with a quitclaim deed, buyer number one just goes to that seller and says, now you must sell to me or I'll sue you.
Oh, wow.
So when you file that claim of interest, it's like handcuffs for a seller. Now, it shouldn't be done unless it's appropriate.
I never knew that.
But it acts like handcuffs, if you will. A seller cannot sell to anyone. Everything now passes through the buyer.
Do you see that often? Like cases like that often?
Well, we see it often, but I think that's part of because of what we do.
Right.
We see it once a week.
Oh, wow.
But I don't know if it's that common.
Yeah, I never experienced anything.
But yes, it's sellers, all kinds of reasons. They don't want to sell. They change their mind. We've had people who say, I don't want to sell anymore. I can't find a new home. Mm-hmm. That's a classic one that we see in the last.
Because there's a lot of contingencies, and a lot of times just so the person can sell the house, they don't disclose that. So whose fault is that? Is that like the agent fault or the seller fault?
Well, the contract control. So if a seller says, I'm only willing to sell if I can sell my home, if it's not in the contract, it doesn't matter that that's what the seller was thinking. It's what does the contract say controls. Now, in my mind, I wouldn't blame the listing agent, but if I'm the listing agent and my seller keeps saying, well, I'm not going to sell unless I have a new home, I would make sure they understand, look, if we put a clause in this contract that says the seller can terminate if they can't find a new home, no buyer is going to accept those terms. And so, seller, you have to sort of make the leap of faith. If you want to sell, you're not going to be able to have those terms there. No one's going to agree to that. So either A, maybe you shouldn't sell, or maybe we should find a new home first, and then you buy it, and then we sell, or just accept that once you sign that contract with the buyer, you have no ability to terminate. The buyer has the ability to terminate, but generally speaking, the seller has no ability to terminate.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
One of the other things, and you have to move me along if you have other questions, but
I have one more. This is a big one. I learned this when I was in continuing education with you. But I want to take a second. If you are still watching this video and you are enjoying this conversation, make sure you hit like, subscribe, and the notification bell, because honestly, this is so much value, right? We had a great conversation. I kind of don't want it to end because I'm learning from you right now. It's insane. But let's talk about foreclosures, right? A lot of people don't know that before going to foreclosure, you can correct me if I'm wrong, you can get your equity back.
So if you're talking about a mortgage foreclosure, so in a mortgage foreclosure, what happens is there's a whole legal process, but effectively the house is sold at an auction. And at the auction, it's open to the public. Anyone can appear and make a bid. The bank or lender will make an opening bid by law. Typically, that amount they bid is the amount of the mortgage. So you owe $100,000, they make an opening bid of $100,000. Then anyone else who attends can make a bid higher. So let's say there's equity in the home. So you owe 100, the bank bids 100. And then 3 or 4 people keep bidding against each other, and now it's 130,000. Well, the bank gets the first 100,000. That's what they're owed.
Right.
The home, after the redemption period, so there is 6 months in which the homeowner can get the property back, but assuming they don't get it back, either they don't want to or they can't afford it, they don't get it back.
In that redemption period, would you advise someone to sell before it goes to foreclosure? Or
well, if there's equity in the home, yes.
Right.
Absolutely. And a lot of times, especially in this market, there's equity. Because if you don't sell, so we'll use our example. So owe 100, it gets bid to 130. Homeowner says, I don't want to redeem it, or I can't afford to redeem it. The homeowner, after the 6-month redemption period, they would be entitled to go after that $30,000, that equity. And there's a process. You have to go to court, but it's actually pretty painless. We help people if they want it, and it's under $1,000. It's worth doing. But the reality is, using the same example, banks owed 100, high bidder at the sheriff's sale bids 130. Well, somebody from the public bids 130, and we represent these people. They're smart, shrewd investors. If they're willing to pay 130, that means if you listed the property, it's probably worth 160 or more.
Way more.
Because they're investors. They're not buying it to live in it, so they need a bigger discount for them to make money when they resell it to the general public.
They typically use a 70% rule, right?
That's what we see. We see that generally they will not pay more than 70% of what they think it's worth in its current condition.
Right.
And they're conservative. They're careful. They should be. And so a lot of times they'll find a home that's in pretty good condition or really good condition. And so there's an even bigger amount of equity in the home when they get it. And so if anybody has a property that goes to foreclosure, and first of all, I go to my real estate professional and say, is there equity? But let's say you're maybe not in a good emotional place, you're sad about what's going on, I'm sure there's other things happening.
Of course.
At the very least, find out what it went to sale for, because if it went to sale for more than what the bank bid, there's equity. There's either money to get, or to me, to get the most money out of it, you want to have a real estate professional like Cheri list. Really, that's, bad things unfortunately happen, and emotionally it can be very difficult.
Yes.
The worst thing you can do is keep your head in the sand and not react. And just a call to a real estate professional. They'll know what to do. They'll guide you through. They'll help you get that equity out, so that at least for the next place you go, maybe it's a softer landing, maybe it's the ability to squirrel some money away.
Is it a time frame in which
there's only 6 months from the time the sheriff's sale occurs to when the redemption.
After, to get the equity if they sell.
So the equity is held by the county treasurer, or actually the sheriff's department at the county, for 3 years. After 3 years, it escheats to the state, which is just the term. It goes to the state automatically. It's an unclaimed fund, like a unclaimed lottery, or I don't know, any kind of funds that someone's holding that's not theirs. Unless someone makes a claim on it within 3 years, by law, it must go to the state.
Wait, can anyone make a claim on it? On that?
Well, anyone that has a valid claim. No. You can't just become like, hey, I'll claim that. No, you have to have a valid. That's funny. You have to have a valid claim. But if someone with a valid claim doesn't step forward, then that money goes to the state. A lot of money goes to the state.
And it's just a simple form that you have to fill out, right?
It's a pretty straightforward form. You have to actually file a lawsuit, but it's really, I mean, it's very straightforward.
Listen, it's worth it, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Even for anything $1,000 or more, you want to go after it. It's worth it, absolutely. But again, if there is $1,000 or more, that means you really want to call your real estate professional, because there's even more money available in a sale.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay, one more question, Dan. We can wrap it up. I'm sure you're a busy man. I have to get back to your other clients. Okay.
Ask away.
How important is a real estate attorney when it comes to someone that's starting a business in real estate, as far as like investment and things like that? And I have one more question after that one. Sure. I just thought of another one.
So for an investor, I think it's very important to have an attorney. You are held to the standard of being a professional, which means you have to abide by all applicable laws. There are concerns about liability, so you might want to use a company, either an S Corp or an LLC, to purchase your investments in. If you have a company that does repairs or flipping, you might want to have a separate company for that. So that's very important. The other thing is, we see a lot of the people that are in business, they don't just have a giant wad of money that they're working from. They're borrowing it, maybe from friends and family, maybe from their self-directed IRA, maybe from an investor. You want to have written agreements. What have you agreed to with the investor? I realize the person may be your friend. I realize that everybody's happy in the beginning because everyone's thinking about, oh, this is going to go great, and I'm going to make this much money, and you're going to make that much money, and we're going to do it again and again and again. But it doesn't always go that way. Sometimes things happen. Sometimes things are outside of the control of the investor.
Give us one example really quick.
Well, we see cost overruns. I mean, the classic is, I've inspected the home. I think the cost to improve is $28,000. And I get in there and I find out there's an issue with the foundation.
Wow.
And now it's another $10,000. And the investor says, well, I only said I'd put in 28. You got to find the 10. You're like, well, I don't have the 10. And you were supposed to do all the investment. And the investor says, where does that say in writing? Well, that's what we talked about. If it's not in writing.
It's not right.
And I'm not saying the investor is the cheat here. I don't know what happened, but
real estate is not verbal.
Yeah, and one of the things when people put things in writing is, at least when we work with clients, and I think a lot of attorneys do it this way, is it forces you to think about the bad things. When you're getting into a real estate deal, nobody's thinking about, oh, what if this happens? What if the person dies? Or what if we found out a bad foundation? Or What if there's an environmental issue? Or what if, nobody thinks about those things. You're thinking about all the positives.
Right.
Otherwise, you wouldn't be doing the deal. But you need to think about those negatives or those potential negatives to make sure that your agreement contemplates everything that can happen. And if a bad thing happens and it's been discussed and it's reduced to writing, it's still not fun. But at least the partners know, okay, you're right. We agreed that any dollar that were required over $28,000, we go 50-50. Investor puts in half, I put in half as the sweat. So I knew that. I signed that. I might not like it, but I know what I agreed to, rather than having these disputes, because the only thing that makes it worse when you find out something that was unexpected is to then have a dispute that brings the thing to a halt. Now, even if you had a chance to sort of work your way through it and still make some money, now you're talking about a loss, you're possibly talking about attorneys, you're possibly talking about a lawsuit. So,
and a rupture of a relationship, you don't want to,
Yeah, take the time to write down exactly what the parties have agreed to. It's critical, and it really prevents fights. People say, well, Rick, that's great if I've got that in case we go to court. And I'd say, well, that's true. But what's more important is it avoids court. Because instead of people looking at each other and say, well, I thought you said this, or I remember it this way. They're like, what does it say? And they read and they're like, we're going to split this 50-50. Seriously, it happens. It's happened to me before. In my own deals. I had a deal where I thought I was going to get 80% of the profits. And we sold it and it was pretty profitable and I was all excited. And my partner called me up, who's a longtime friend. I mean, long time. We had done many deals together. And he said, oh, that's great, Rick. You're going to get, I don't know, like $27,000. I'm like, $27,000? I'm supposed to get like $44,000. And I didn't say anything, but I was like, I'm like, okay. And I pulled out the operating agreement and I'm like, no, 50-50. I'm like, dang
you
it.
missed that.
So I never said, my friend he doesn't know to this day. Because
now he do if he watched this video.
Well, but the thing is, it reminded me of what I've agreed to, because people sometimes remember the way they want to remember it. Not that they're lying to themselves, but just, I thought we said this. I thought we said that. No, it says right there, here's what we agreed to. And so that's why I think it's so critical to write it down. It benefits everyone. So that's what I would do for sure if I'm an investor. Make sure you get insurance. Make sure you use a company to shield yourself from liability. Make sure you put things in writing.
Yes, great advice. Really take that advice, and I hope you're taking notes so you can follow this along and you can refer back to it. So, as far as an attorney, how do you get paid? Like, when do a buyer or seller pay you to, break that down for us?
So, in residential transactions, I mean, as much as this hurts me to say, you don't always need an attorney. In fact, a lot of residential transactions, you do not need an attorney. And when you need an attorney, sometimes people will know by what happens, but other times you'll look to your real estate professional for guidance. Hey, is this normal? Should I be talking to an attorney? And your agent might say, no, this is normal, don't worry. Or you should probably consult with an attorney. So in a residential transaction, you don't always need an attorney. When you hire an attorney, attorneys charge one of three ways. They either charge a flat fee. So to review this document or to write this addendum, I'm going to charge $500. Or they do it hourly. So I charge this much per hour, and whatever time it takes me, although usually you get an estimate. I think that'll take an hour and a half. I think that'll take 2 hours and 10 minutes. You'll get an estimate. And there's an hourly rate, and it's applied to that. And the last way is contingent, meaning the attorney takes a percentage if they're successful and they collect. Now, that's not as common in real estate, the contingent. We see that like with commissions, when we sue on behalf of brokers for people that don't honor their contracts to collect commissions, we'll do that contingent. There's some other things contingent, but mostly in real estate, you're going to see a flat fee or hourly. There should always be a written agreement between the parties. Attorney should not be billing you unless you've signed something in writing that says, I agree to be billed, and here's the scope of work that I agree to be billed for, and here's the way you're going to bill me. It's a flat fee, it's hourly, whatever it is. That always should be the case. You should be worried if somebody says, oh yeah, don't worry, we've got an agreement. That's a bad sign. I'm not saying the person's going to do something improper, but that's a bad sign. It always sign, and you shouldn't be charged unless you've agreed to be charged. Otherwise, everything is free. And we tell our clients, when we talk to them in a consultation, we explain what we think should be done, approximately how much it might take, what's the chance of success, or whatever they're trying to achieve. And then the client says, I don't want to do that, Rick. Like the person who had water in their garage. We explained, you're going to lose. Don't hire me. Don't waste your money. Versus somebody would say, we think we can win, or this is what we charge for a flat fee. And the person says, great. And then they sign a retainer.
Nice. Well, you heard it here first. Real estate is definitely not verbal. Make sure you get everything in written form, documented, like everything just to cover yourself, right?
Absolutely. The law says, effectively, if it's not in writing, it didn't happen. So you literally, there's something called the statute of frauds that says certain types of contracts have to be in writing to be enforceable. I know you know that well. And people say, well, okay, Rick, but what does that really mean? That means if I told Cheri, I'll sell you my house for $1. And Cheri says, $1? I don't even know your house, Rick, but yeah, $1. I bet it's worth more than $1. And Cheri says, okay, great. She goes out to her car, opens her wallet, brings me back one shiny dollar, and I say, Cheri, I changed my mind. She's like, Rick, I was gone for 2 minutes. I know I changed my mind, Cheri. Cheri now takes me to court. Says in court, well, Rick said he would sell me his house for $1. Jay heard him say it. You can't see Jay, but Jay heard him say it. Jay testifies. Rick said that. I get up on the stand. I say, I said that, Your Honor. And the judge says, okay, are you still prepared to sell it for $1? And I say, no, I changed my mind. And the court says, then unenforceable, no contract.
What about text?
Good question on text. Generally speaking, texts are deemed to be oral communications, the same as a phone call.
I never knew that.
Always use an email.
Okay.
And now some communications aren't necessary to be on email. The problem is, well, if you were saying, hey, I'm going to have a contractor go to the house to look at it tonight at 8. Well, that could be a text. Okay. That's not a contract.
Right.
The problem is, at least from my opinion, is you don't know until it's too late. If you always communicate by email, you don't have to worry about when do I have to have it in writing and when is it okay if it's not in writing. If it's always an email, it's always writing because the courts deem emails to be written communication. Just like I hand drafted a letter or fax, it's considered the exact same. And so always use email. We have, I can think of some commission agreements. Wow. Someone negotiated a commercial building. They were going to get $110,000 commission. Huge commission. And it was all text messages. What? It's unenforceable in court. It said right in there, seller says, I'll give you, I forget what it was, 8% on the sale of the price of the building. It's unenforceable. So
did that person get paid or?
No.
Wow.
And they came to us and were like, you have text.
So text do not hold up in court. Make sure you use your email, written form.
Always use email.
Okay.
Do not use text.
That's you just taught me that, honestly.
I mean, other than, hey, I'm running late, I'll be there at the house in 5 minutes, or hey, it was great to see you, let's circle back and sign a purchase agreement. Those kinds of texts are fine, but the problem is everyone's in the habit of using text. I use text. My kids use text. Everyone I know uses text. But it can be dangerous in real estate because you're so used to using text. People prefer text over emails. But the email is a critical thing if you're trying to demonstrate something right.
What about if it's a documentation but it's sent through text? Do that still hold up or no?
Well, if you send the document, if you have acknowledgement that they've received it, but you're talking like an offer?
Yeah.
The problem is that text, there's something called the mailbox rule. And the mailbox rule goes back, I think 200 years. And what it says is that, let me take a step back. For a contract to be binding, you have to have offer, communication of the offer, acceptance of the offer, and communication of the acceptance. Then you have a binding contract. So now we go to the mailbox rule. The mailbox rule says that Cheri makes an offer to me, I accept it, I sign it, I put it in an envelope, and the minute I drop it in the mailbox, it's deemed that Cheri has received it. You say, but Rick, she couldn't have received it. It just went in the mailbox. It's going to be like at least 2 days, 3 days. Doesn't matter. The law says you have now, the communication of the acceptance has happened when I dropped it in the mail. That's when it happened.
So when you bottom line a contract, that's just acknowledgement of it. But
that's just, bottom line is not required in the state of Michigan.
Wow.
Because it's communication and acceptance. Now, bottom line is great because now there's no question.
Right.
You're acknowledging the communication of the acceptance.
Yeah.
So take the mailbox rule and now apply it to emails. What the mailbox rule says about emails is the minute I hit send. So I sign the contract, I accept Cheri's offer, I attach it to my email, and I send to Cheri. The minute I hit send, it's deemed you've received it. even though you might not look at your email till the next day, might be at night, whether you're on vacation, whatever.
Right.
Your email's down, doesn't matter. It's deemed accepted at that point. So if you try to call me up and say, hey, Rick, I literally hit send, you call me up and, yeah, Rick, I'm rescinding that offer. Too late, Cheri. Like, what do you mean too late? I haven't gotten any communication from you, Rick, that it's been accepted. Cheri, I hit the email, I can show you the send, but look, and you see, and you're like, he accepted it before I rescinded it. So use email. With text, it's not verified when it was received, so you don't have that proof of the communication of the acceptance. Now, if you communicate the acceptance and someone bottom lines it, well then, yeah, that's your proof right there, the bottom lining. But again, I don't like that because what if they don't bottom line it? What if they think about it? What if all these things happen? Whereas the email, it doesn't matter. Once I've communicated, when I hit that send, it doesn't matter if you say, well, I never saw it, Rick, or my client changed their mind, or it doesn't, it's all too late. I've already hit send, and we now have a binding contract.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Can you think of any other things that you would like to share with the audience? Or
one of the things we see a lot is properties that are encumbered by restrictions. So most common is a condominium. Now, when I say condominium, we have different types of condominiums in the state of Michigan.
Right.
We have your traditional condominiums where the buildings are attached and they might be on, the units might be stacked or next to each other. That's very common. But we also have something called a site condominium. And a site condominium looks like a single family home. In fact, most single family developments you see today are actually site condominiums. They function like a traditional platted sub. Those are the two ways you can get real estate approved in Michigan for splitting. They function very similarly, but a site condominium will have what's called a master deed and bylaws. And those are the rules of the subdivision.
And that's like the HOA?
Yeah, the homeowner association. And so it says what you can and can't do.
Right.
And when people get their title commitment, it will say right on there, here are the documents that encumber your property. So there could be an easement for DTE, an easement for the road. You want those things, by the way. Encumbrance normally has a bad sort of ring to it, but no, you want the road because how do you get to the property? You want DTE because you want electric, you want Comcast, you want these things. And also say deed restrictions. And you might want the deed restrictions because some deed restrictions you might find helpful. Hey, nobody can park work trucks in their driveway. Nobody can have above ground pool in their front yard. Nobody can have, big signs. I mean, things that you might want as a homeowner. We see a lot of people never read these documents. They never, ever read them. And they should be reading them, not the real estate professional. Not that a real estate professional couldn't do it.
But the real estate professional definitely should be obtaining these documents and forwarding it over to that person.
I think that's the wise thing to do. Now, most title commitments will have a hyperlink. It's in blue on the on the email, and the homeowner or the homeowner-to-be can just click on it and they can see it. But they don't read them. And sometimes it doesn't matter because there's nothing they want to do. But other times people will say, well, I wanted a fence in my yard for my dog, or I wanted to put a pool in, or I wanted to put a gazebo in, or I want these things that they want to do, and they can't do them. And they say, but it's not fair, Rick, and I didn't know. And
do most people blame their agent for not letting them?
We hear a lot of, my agent should have told me. They knew I wanted a fence.
Yeah.
And the answer is, no, your agent shouldn't have told you because an agent is not to be reviewing those documents. That's actually considered the unauthorized practice of law. So agents should not be reviewing those documents because you're asked for a legal conclusion. Homeowner says, I want a fence. Agent, read these 80 pages of master deed and bylaws and tell me if I can have a fence. Well, that's not what agents are trained for. More importantly, even if they knew exactly what they're doing, they're not supposed to. Typically, you're prevented from doing that by your policies and procedures and license law with unauthorized practice law. So I would argue that as an agent, you cannot do that. You should not do it. You're violating license law. But of course, buyers don't always think that way. They say, well, they should have told me. And I said, no, that's not how the law works. They should not have told you. Well, I didn't know. And I said, I believe you didn't actually know. But the way the law looks at it is they call it constructive notice, which means you bought this property, you got a title commitment, the register of deeds says exactly what you can and can't do.
And those documents are typically in the title.
Correct.
Commitment.
They are. And the fact that you didn't take the time to read them, you may not have known in your head. You may not have what's called actual notice, but you definitely had constructive notice, which means you are bound by those rules. So read your restrictions. They probably won't be a big deal, but read them. Make sure you understand.
Is it by law that you have to have the commitments by a certain time of closing?
No, there's no. The contract usually controls. Most contracts say the title commitment within 5 days or 10 days. And if the title commitment wasn't provided till, let's say, the day of, the buyer could say, wait a minute, I'm not closing. I need to review these.
Right.
Just like everything else. If it's not provided to you timely as a buyer, you need to say, I need to wait. I need to review this. I need to look into this, whatever it is. Don't buy until you know. So look at those documents. Most buyers that I run into, it wasn't that they received the commitment late. They never ever looked at it.
They don't even look at the email.
No, they don't open it. That's exactly true. They don't even open it to say, oh yeah, I'm not going to look at this or that. They don't even know what this or that is because they never ever looked at the title company.
Yeah, I tell my clients, I know the title company send them the documents, but also I forward it to them. Like, make sure you review everything. Even with contracts, like send them purchase agreements. A lot of times people don't even read. Like, they'll be at the closing table. Oh, what is this fee for? It's in the documents before you sign.
It's I can't say I read every contract. I'm sure there are contracts I get where I'm buying something for $10 and I'm like, I don't even care what this says. I'm like, lawyers are people too.
Right.
But I'm buying real estate. I am reading it front to back 2 times. I want to make sure I didn't miss anything, that I clearly understand.
Exactly.
And quite honestly, I might have questions. And then I'm going to ask my real estate professional, well, I think I know what this means, but what does this exactly mean?
Right.
There are no dumb questions, not when you're spending $100 or hundreds of thousands of dollars. You ask those questions. You deserve the answers. You should be comfortable in what you're doing because the old adage about this is the most expensive investment you ever make usually is actually true.
It's true.
It is.
It's true. So a lot of value there. And do you have anything you want to close us out?
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity. Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity. And if you or your listening audience has questions, feel free to call my office. We're happy to take those calls. I can't say we get to every call when they come in. We are in court. We are, not doing interviews, but I like this. I like that. That doesn't happen very often. But we're in court. We're on the phone. We're talking to other clients, talking to other attorneys. We try to take the calls when they come in. If we can't take your call when it comes in, please let the person who answers my phone know, and they will find a time for us to talk to you about your matter, whether it's with your real estate professional or something you want to talk about, maybe not without your real estate professional, but that you don't need your real estate professional involved in.
Yeah, and that's true. So I'll put Rick information on how to reach him in the description, so make sure you look at that. And also it will be on the screen too. And it's been real. I had a great conversation with you, Rick. Thank you for taking the time. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Also, hit that notification bell, that like button, and leave a comment on any questions that you may have so I can forward over to Rick if you do.
Thank you.
Thank you.